Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you. I'm Susan Wienecke, editorial director of Richmond Magazine. On behalf of our entire Richmond Magazine staff, I want to thank you for going on this three-part journey with us. As President Obama said in his farewell address earlier this week, change only happens when ordinary people get involved, get engaged, and then come together to demand that change. Identifying what change you want to help with in Richmond is what tonight is all about. Listen and learn from our experts and historians and ask them many questions. I'm going to hand it over to Sam, the co-creator of our series and our arts and entertainment editor at the magazine, to introduce our moderator for tonight.
Good evening. First of all, I want to thank everybody who took the time to come out this evening. I am extremely excited that so many people thought it worthy to come and talk about the state of race in the city of Richmond. So thank you so much for coming. And I'm going to go right into our introduction of our lovely moderator. Tonight with us we have Karla Redditte. Karla Redditte has worked as a reporter and anchor for NBC 12 News since September 2012. A native of Memphis, Tennessee, she received her undergraduate degree from Loyola University in New Orleans and a graduate degree from the University of Missouri-Columbia. Before coming to Richmond, Karla reported in several markets, including Biloxi, Mississippi, Savannah, Georgia, and Huntsville, Alabama. Thank you so much. Let's welcome our moderator of the evening, Karla Redditte.
Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Samantha, as you were reading that, I was thinking all of those cities need the conversation that we're having tonight. So thank you so much. Thank you, Samantha, for inviting me to be the moderator, and thank you so much to Richmond Magazine for allowing me to do this as well. Thank you all once again for joining us tonight. I want to thank our community partners before we get started. And you can find a list of them on the back of your program tonight. And also want to thank Shindigs. Many of you may have noticed the refreshments as you were coming in. Shindigs provided tonight's refreshments. So if you didn't, there you go. Exactly. They certainly deserve a round of applause. So if you haven't taken part in the refreshments tonight, you can certainly get them during our intermission tonight. This is part 2 of the Unmasking. This is the backstory tonight, the backstory breakdown. Tonight you will hear from our historians, educators, and community leaders about historical perspectives on race here in Richmond, as well as why it is still a divisive issue today. So it's certainly going to be a very interesting discussion tonight. Before we get started, I just wanted to let you know that we are live streaming tonight. So on richmondmag.com/unmasking, you can find us live streaming. And if you have any questions, you can certainly type them up on Facebook and submit them, and we'll try to get those questions answered for you tonight. You can also use Unmasking RVA hashtag. That's on Twitter, on Instagram, whatever social media that you use. Just use that hashtag, and we can get that as well. Before we get to the questions tonight, just wanted to remind you that some of these questions are coming from part 1 of this discussion. So many of you that participated in part 1, you left your questions on the table, where tonight we're going to get those answers from our distinguished panelists. And thank you all so much for joining us. We want to introduce our panelists tonight as well. Just raise your hands when I call your name. This is the panelists for part A: Greg Kimball, Free Eganfimi, Kristen Green, Dr. Julian Hayter, the Reverend Ben Campbell, Dr. Larinette Lee, and Osita Oriebu. Let's give our panelists a round of applause. First, we want to start with asking the panelists something that astounds them in your studies, but focusing on your studies. So just about 30 seconds of what astounds you when it comes to history in Richmond based on your background. It's kind of heavy, huh?
It is. I came to Richmond 30 years ago after growing up in New England. I was still a damn Yankee when I came. I was in the military, went to school. I finally ended up with a PhD from the University of Virginia. And I think when I came here, like New Englanders, I found Virginians are very chauvinistic about their history. The problem is they really don't know their history. They've told themselves, we all have told ourselves a lot of stories about what went on in this city and what we learned from those books that we read in school that were just fundamentally wrong. And unfortunately, it's been pretty hard as a public historian for the last 30 years to penetrate that. Did an exhibit, I think, in 1988 on called In Bondage and Freedom, which is my first foray into the issue of race here. And it is the issue of Richmond, as far as I'm concerned.
Excellent book. It's one of my favorites of his. What astounds me? Okay, so I'm an independent historical activist. My name is Free Egun Femi, and I founded Untold RVA, which is a crowd-funded, crowd-sourced from the beginning historical reclamation network, basically. There are things I think that have been left out of the historical record because to know them would empower the people that were intended to be dissuaded from success, namely people with deep concentrations of melanin. So I'm going to give you the numbers that astound me most, which are the basis of my forthcoming book, Self-Determined Richmond. In 1850, which was 15 years before the end of enslavement, a young black girl like my daughter there would have been on the auction block in Shockoe Bottom at the cost of $450, which through the inflation calculator, the federal inflation calculator in 2015 would have equaled $12,803 for my baby. There were approximately 30,000 people sold in the 10 years between 1850 and 1860 before the end of enslavement that happened in 1865 at the end of the Civil War here in Richmond, Virginia. So if you were to conflate that $12,803 for each one of those 30,000 people sold for the 10-year period, you would arrive upon $1,024,200,000, which would have been the cost that would have been generated from the black people sucked out of families and lining the pockets of people who exist in Richmond as prominent families today. That, to me, is astounding.
You know, I think what I find most astounding kind of plays off of what both Greg and Free mentioned, which is the deep denial that I feel like many residents of Richmond, wider Virginia, the South, America, as it turns out, live in. And part of this is was a reaction to the book I wrote about Prince Edward County, where I grew up, which closed its schools for 5 years rather than desegregate. I think, you know, part of the denial is just not knowing the history and not being curious about learning our full history. Part of it is that it hasn't all been written. A lot of it is still hidden. And I think the denial runs to what the impact of not knowing those histories is on the people that were most affected by them, in particular our black community here. And so I think many of the people here believe that they are evolved and that they consider themselves progressive, but I think there's a long way to go, and that a lot of people have sort of no desire to do the work that it would take to move beyond that denial.
Thank you, Kristen. My name's Laura Nett. It's such a pleasure to be here to discuss this important subject about race. It's a subject that is very difficult to discuss because we all live in this society and we don't really face what's right in front of us. What really has astounded me about Richmond is that it was the second largest slave trading center in the South. Most people don't know that. Our children are not taught that in school. And then we don't make the connection of why people are living in conditions that they're living in now, and how that connection with slavery and race is still very present with us.
Thanks, Lornette. I think we really need to in many ways, start dealing with the 20th century as well. Very few people know this, that Richmond is, in terms of residential housing, more segregated by race in 1980 than it was in 1960, right? And that really cuts against the triumph narrative that we call the civil rights movement. In many ways, I think that there was a deep-seated belief well into the twilight of the 20th century where people thought that, especially poor African Americans were inevitably incorrigible. And I think that that belief still permeates the dialogue, particularly the dialogue that we have about poverty in this city, in large part because of some of the gains of the civil rights movement in some ways have been washed away by the residual leftovers of 20th century policies, urban policies, housing policies, slum clearance. Those things had a profound influence on the ways that people did and did not develop into the 20th century. And unfortunately, I think the gains of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 have been washed away to a certain degree by the persistence of these social problems and the belief that, again, that African Americans in poor communities are inevitably incorrigible.
Okay, can you hear me now? Yes. All right, awesome. I'm Osita Iroebu, and I was born and raised in Richmond, Virginia. Grew up in Hillside Court Public Housing community pretty much all of my life. Went to Richmond Public Schools, and I would say that although there were challenges there, I loved RPS for many reasons. And I am a first-generation Nigerian American as well. And so those two demographics, public housing and immigrants, actually are two demographics that have for a very long time been invisible within our city, and they continue to be invisible. When we talk about immigration, locally as well as nationwide, we don't talk about African immigrants. They're always left out of the conversation. And so I would like for us to include African immigrants and their hopes, their dreams, their challenges in our conversation. So I'm astounded by the fact that we continue to ignore and diminish this very important population. And of course, public housing residents as well. Throughout all of the public housing neighborhoods within the city of Richmond, we have about 10% of the city's population. And over half of those residents are children. And so we're, again, ignoring not just the population, but our children. And so I'm astounded by the fact that we're continuing along that spectrum that continues to erode our community and push injustice and continues to develop a culture of fear and disinformation within our society.
Wow. Okay, I wrote a book. I don't get any money off it. I want you to read it though, but it's 250 pages of what I was surprised about. Seriously, and I'm a 7th generation Virginian, and I already knew Virginia was all about race. But why? And the narrative was, and I didn't want to live in Richmond either, and I don't know how I got here, but I like it, so there we are. They said Richmond was stuck in the Civil War, and it isn't. It has nothing to do with the Civil War. That just puts a little gloss over what Richmond is about. And the history really does go back to the beginning of the 1600s or earlier, and as we trace it, we begin to see the depth of it. In about 1995, a bunch of folks started talking about the slave trade in Richmond. We tried to explore it some. We all thought it was about folks coming from Africa and being sold in Richmond. Nobody told us that Richmond didn't exist in 1774 when the African slave trade stopped in Virginia. In fact, there was this enormous downriver slave trade of 300 to 500,000 people that nobody talked about in the Virginia history books. And black people didn't tell each other about it, and white people didn't tell each other about it. For 120 years, the city that thought that history was the most important thing just happened to forget this little fact of history. That's one of the things that we see. The one thing that's clear today, that was clear when I started looking at this, is that Richmond was stuck. And the question today is, can that change?
As you can tell, we are going to learn a lot tonight. We have a fantastic group of panelists up here tonight. And I want to remind you that you can read all of their bios in your program, so you can learn a little bit more about them. But we're going to start with our questions tonight. And as I start with the questions, I want you to think of questions as well, because if we have time, we'll certainly ask your questions that you have for our panelists tonight. So panelists, you ready? All right. First question. So often when people talk about race, they think about it on a micro level. We're talking about interpersonal interactions. But some of the most far-reaching and damaging discrimination occurred through law and policy. Redlining, for example. So to what degree did race factor into decision-making at all levels of government in the 20th century? And that's open for any of the panelists. Free. Okay.
Mine kind of can lay a foundation for what everyone else is going to go and say. So more statistics, but I think they're fascinating. In 1920, which, let's see, 1865 was the end of the Civil War, so what is that, 75, 85, 95? How many? 55 years. That's one grandma, right? One grandma after the end of enslavement in Richmond, Virginia. We had 170,000 people total in Richmond, Virginia. Interestingly, right now, in 2015, 2016, we have 204,000 total residents of Richmond, 50% black, 40% white, and 10% mixed of others. Okay, in 1920, there were 24 black doctors, 15 black nurses, 12 black lawyers, 7 black dentists, 55 black dressmakers, 4 black banks, 3 newspapers, black-owned, 14 black funeral homes, 5 black theaters, 9 black insurance firms, 135 black barbers, because you know. But here's the greatest one of my list. 139 retail grocers, black-owned. So we have to get it together because we've declined in our black excellence. So please.
Do you mind? No, go ahead. Yeah. By the way, those are fascinating numbers, and I think one of the things that, and I don't want to steal Dr. Meeser's thunder, particularly when it comes to the New Deal and the way the policy cut against everything that you just delineated, right? But the systematic disinvestment, the answer to the question is race played a profound part in New Deal policy, in large part because the federal government left states up to decide how New Deal laws were to be divvied out. And we all knew how that played out when things got beneath the Mason-Dixon line. And what eventually happens to all of the things that she just talked about is a systematic disinvestment in those neighborhoods, right? Federal policies. In many ways, whites use New Deal laws to raise their standard of living at the expense of African-American communities. There's systematic wholesale disinvestment in these areas. And by the mid-1950s and the 1960s, what wasn't done by the New Deal was done by slum clearance and urban renewal, right? So in many ways, all the things that we had built up during segregation, all the resources she just delineated were undermined by the lack of investment by the federal government, by local government, and by state government.
Yeah, I want to just say too, though, that people make decisions. It isn't always the state. So, for instance, I go to labor history because that's one of the things I'm really interested in. There were elections under the National Labor Relations Board that was created in the New Deal in Richmond's tobacco factories. All of the white workers voted for the American Federation of Labor. Why? Because that was a white-controlled union. They enforced a segregation within the factory so blacks couldn't take certain positions. It was clear hierarchy of skill within that. Guess the African Americans voted for who? The CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, because they knew they had a much more progressive view of that. Guess what? There was no union, right? So it isn't, the state doesn't always completely get it wrong. The NLRB was probably a good thing, but the reality on the ground is even that didn't help in the situation that Richmond was in.
So if you want to see the structural stuff and the legal stuff in Virginia, it goes all the way through to today. I could give you examples of what's in the legislature today, but you might just look at who gets to vote if they've got a felony conviction. That would be a nice place to look. 200,000 people. Look at the period from 1970 to 1972 or so, and I told John I'd be taking all my stuff out of his book anyway. But three very important things happen at that period of time. First, Virginia's massive resistance program is overthrown, and the schools really do have to integrate. No longer can we have a dual school system in Virginia. They'd integrated a few, but kept the dual school system. Second thing that happens is that we have this enormous urban renewal program that basically completely destroys most of the black neighborhoods in town, invades every single one, and creates freeways that go to the county lines. And the third thing that happens is that the Virginia General Assembly passes a law that says that Richmond will not ever annex territory. Now, it was done temporarily at that point, but we all know what temporary means, and that's it. The temporary is still on, by the way. It's been 50 years. What that did was to recreate racial segregation in the form of jurisdictional lines. And not only did that, it created segregated transportation, which is probably the most evil thing we've got right now, although there's a lot of things vying for that. But basically, it was freeways for suburbanites and buses that could be stopped at the suburban lines for the people living in the city. Today, 90% of our jobs are inaccessible by public transportation. You want to make somebody's life hell. That's what you've done. Now, these are all structural things, and if you're in Virginia, it's extremely subtle. What they do in the Virginia legislature, now I'm telling the truth because I know these things and I've been working with them for years. What they do in the Virginia legislature is they decide how it is they want to discriminate, and then they draw up a law that doesn't look like it discriminates, that does what they want to do.
By the way,
that's it.
Can I just add something? The moratorium on annexations is not specific to Richmond, by the way. It's throughout the Commonwealth of.
Well, there were different moratoria. There was actually a law passed which applied only to Richmond, which
and then
dealt
throughout
with
the 70s,
which dealt with cities of 150,000 and or more. There were only 3 such cities, and Richmond was the only one affected by it. So they actually did something particular to us. But Petersburg, you want to know why Petersburg's bankrupt? It happened in 1970. It didn't happen last week. The decisions that were made that made Petersburg economically non-viable and majority lower income African American were made 50 years ago. And finally, after 50 years of desperation, Jack Barry's going down there for 3 months to fix it, and we're praying for him. I'll tell you that.
Now, see that. Actually, we're going to move on. That was one question, but you see how much we've learned just from that one question. That's why we're going to move on, just so we can get just some more knowledge tonight. We're going to try to answer all of these great questions with our great, fantastic panelists. Next question. It seems everyone talks about the need for more regional cooperation among cities and counties. Historically, what role has race played in hindering relationships between the city and the counties? And some of you have already touched on that in the first question.
Dylan's rule. I'm gonna drop the mic.
That means the state basically determines what happens in local government. And you can't do anything in local government that hasn't had prior approval from the state legislature. And what that essentially means is that a rural-dominated reactionary state legislature can basically make life impossible for city centers as long as it wants to.
Anyone else?
Well, I'll add, it's actually, I think it's good, yeah, thank you. I'll actually touch upon the previous question as well within this response. We think about, again, public housing and the fact that supposedly around 1940 it was created to destroy the environment of slumlords, right? So slumlord presence in the city, and then we have public housing, and 1940 Gilpin Court is constructed, and which is the oldest public housing neighborhood within the city of Richmond. And it's interesting because that was supposed to be in response to slumlord, dwelling, and look what we have today, And so it's interesting that it became what it was supposed to actually absolve, and over the decades. And I think that the fact that we have hundreds of public housing units within the city, within isolated communities, and not in the county, again, is one of those systemic structural conundrums, right, of our time. And the fact that these communities, of course, as we all know, are primarily Black neighborhoods. You may have a few white people and Latinos also in these neighborhoods, but majority African American communities. Why is that the case? We mentioned redlining. I'm talking about also race-based zoning, right? So when we talk about segregation, we're talking about the fact that these communities were intentionally created to isolate Black low-income persons into certain parts of our city, and then as a result, they no longer have access to the resources, economic resources, transportation as well, food resources. We're talking about food deserts as well now within the majority of our neighborhoods, mostly low-income neighborhoods, and these are all within the city, not in the county. So then we think about why is that the case, and who allowed that to happen, and why are we still allowing that to happen today?
I probably know the answer to this, but I'm curious what you think. Will the counties ever wake up? Because they are now seeing also low-income areas. There's no immunity because there's a political line. So what do we think Henrico and Chesterfield will finally figure this out and maybe be a little more play ball with the city and try to address some of these things?
I wonder if there are demographic trends taking place in this city that are going to force some changes despite this itself, right? With the movement of people into the city from the counties, I mean, we started to see, right, population decline in the counties and the movement of lower-income people in the counties. If these demographic trends are going to force policymakers to address things that they've been able to ignore for decades, in large part, which is in large part some of it's, of course, because of gentrification, right? Economically depressed neighborhoods, or people are just gobbling up properties in these neighborhoods, and now you see diversification in areas that 20 years ago were almost racially homogenous. So in some way, I think that some of these larger trends of people moving around are going to have an influence on city-county relationships that policymakers didn't see coming maybe 10 to 15 years ago.
But of course, it all matters who's sitting at the table when decisions are made. Sure. We need more people from diverse populations stepping up and taking roles in local politics and government. And given the state of politics now, you see there's a critical need, but people don't want to step into that fray because it does open you up to so much that you really don't want to get involved with. But when we think about the welfare of our communities, we see a crisis in leadership, and that's something that needs to be addressed across all demographic groups.
Okay. All right. Well, next question, and we've touched on this just a little bit earlier. In the 1950s, the state of Virginia approved a plan to build I-95 through one of Richmond's oldest historically black neighborhoods, Jackson Ward. What other Richmond infrastructure decisions or discussions have had strong racial components?
So if you want to see the I-95 story quickly, go to where Brook Road crosses the railroad tracks on the way to the north side, and you'll see what is the natural route through a valley for I-95. It's 4 blocks north of the 80-foot deep trench that they dug through a neighborhood, displacing 10,000 people. There's still nothing in that valley except a railroad track. There's room for about 20 lanes of traffic. It would have been a third as expensive, and it's very puzzling why they built that. Now, since that time, transportation is far more important than people realize. I mean, I believe in the divine theory of transportation. You know, God put the James River here, and that's why we have a city. And George Allen put a $1.1 billion circumferential highway around Richmond, and that's why we're in danger of losing the entire metropolitan city to a kind of a Prince William County type of development. Where you do your transportation is where your life occurs. And $1.1 billion in state and federal money given free to Henrico and Chesterfield and Hanover, just to build a nice road where there was nobody at the time. So that's major infrastructure, and represents an enormous investment. So it really wouldn't be too much to have a public transportation system for the metropolitan city, would it? And if you want a map of it, it's right here.
I'll add some other, just very brief, the Coliseum,
Okay.
the downtown expressway, right? And the expressway system. Even Henry Marsh and Howard Carwile in the late 1960s, right, argue that they should have built the downtown expressway closer to the James River in large part, where they're battling for this in City Hall in large part because they know what building that downtown expressway is going to do to the Randolph area, to the Bird Park area, and in the neighborhoods that were in there. So there are a couple. I mean, there's all these things. You might be able to make a pretty strong case for the 6th Street Market. But there are all of these silver bullet strategies that policymakers devise in the 20th century that are supposed to save Richmond, the Coliseum being one of them, the 6th Street Market being the other, that don't necessarily have the type of influence that policymakers thought. Now, I think, of course, with the freeway and whatnot is another matter, but I think that there are all of these things that people devise to try to save the city, particularly after 1965, that don't work out as people had intended.
I also want to add of the grassroots efforts of the people, particularly the people of 6 Mount Zion Church, where if you go there now, or if you're on the highway, you can see the back of the church. The people there fought vociferously to save that church because those in positions of power were just going to wipe it out. And it's a church that's still very active today, and that grassroots effort still continues.
I've often wondered, I don't know, I've never seen a smoking gun for this statement, but why did Richmond get rid of its trolley system in the 1946 was it, John? 48. It was a vigorous system. It went all over the city, went to every one of the suburbs, even the inner suburbs like Barton Heights. Why did they do that? Why did they take away a really good piece of infrastructure that connected almost every single neighborhood in the city?
I think if you look at the master plan, you know, when cities overhauled themselves to alleviate automobile congestion in the mid 20th century, they only use a handful of firms. They bring them in to redesign these cities, and the plan was, for many of these national firms, to build freeways. I guess that's my short answer, is that you get these national firms coming into local places that aren't sensitive to local issues, right?
And in fact, as a great source, being a librarian, I love sources and the real stuff. Look at the Bartholomew Plan. That's it.
What I'm talking about.
He did 3 of them.
That's exactly what I'm talking about.
And just there, we have them at the library. I'm sure the Valentine has them. Go and look at those. And there are detailed maps that are race-based. They show where the black population is. They show where the white population is. It's very clear what's going on.
He did 400 cities, one firm, and it was a St. Louis firm. You want to know where Ferguson comes from? Go to Harlan Bartholomew's plan for St. Louis, which is where he started.
Can I say one more? Which, by the way, means that if you think about what Reverend Campbell just said, there are things that aren't necessarily specific to Richmond about the types of things that the African American community endured, right? You can really apply these to African American cities throughout the United States. It's not a Southern problem. It's a problem with design. And this isn't specific to Richmond in large part because they're using only a handful of firms to recraft these cities, right? So you can see Ferguson, you can see Detroit, Chicago, Richmond, St. Louis. It all kind of fits together if you understand the history.
And we have to keep in mind also there's this concern, this fear amongst whites of blacks and whites sitting in public conveyances. And they wanted to make sure that that ended. And it was not just in Virginia, but all over the South and the North as well.
And I also like to add that we talked about transportation as infrastructure. There's current advocacy taking place now regarding the bus rapid transit that will subsequently remove certain bus stops from certain communities. And we know when things happen, for the most part, there is a certain population that bears the brunt of these new concepts or these new ideas or these changes within our city. And so if you have a family or an individual who relies on public transportation to go to and from work, to access job, resources, money, and then you remove those bus stops, what's next? You know, how can they then access their livelihood for themselves and their family? And then also, I'm thinking again on the end of housing, how mixed income, mixed use communities can be potentially infrastructure as well. You know, so we talk about infrastructure as commerce, as the going and coming of goods and services and things of that sort. So mixed income neighborhoods, for the most part, are implemented to create a sense of economic vitality within a city, right? But then who ends up being the population that, again, bears the brunt of these new developments? And then where do they go once the mixed income communities come? The people who were there previously in these neighborhoods and these housing units, again, primarily public housing developments, where do they go? How are they being pushed? How are they being divided? How are their families and communities and social networks being dispersed? And what happens to them, you know, down the road? So I think we have to see it not just as these huge concepts, but also how these huge concepts trickle down into the lives and livelihoods of individuals and families and children.
Okay.
So I'm involved with the bus stops. And let me just say that every low-income neighborhood in Richmond is going to have twice the bus service that it has right now when the new system is put in place. And part of the way you get that is a bus every 15 minutes rather than every half hour or hour, is by making the bus stops 3 blocks apart rather than 2 blocks apart, which means that the maximum walk is 1.5 blocks rather than 1 block. Now, whether that's the best way to do it or not, I don't know, but there is more service being provided because I know the map, I helped create it, and I'll be glad to talk about that further. But she's right in that every time we do something, and this has been true in Virginia from the beginning, we have tended to pass the discrimination of the previous decade on in new form to the discrimination of the next decade. And it is done in such a way that it seems unremarkable. People don't have to advocate it anymore because it's just the way things are. And that's pretty much the way Virginia's been.
Okay. All right, we're going to have to come back. We're going
Okay.
to come back because this is a hot topic, but let me move on to the next question so we'll have time to come back to that one. Do you buy the "we need to keep the Confederate monuments on Monument Avenue to remember our history" argument? Or do you think the city should remove them? How important is it for our public art to reflect our racial history?
I'll jump in.
Yo. Wheelhouse. I've developed a relationship with Ellen Parker, who is our awesome. If you don't know her, she's running the Public Art Commission here in Richmond, and we're going to see some changes because she wants to use public art and actually that 1% fund that is going to open up a lot of opportunities to change some racial dynamics here in Richmond. She just was blowing up my phone like, I wonder if my question's going to get through, and it did. So, what's up, Ellen? Made it. Absolutely. Her ideas are fascinating. I've been able to identify ways to even get public history through public art. There's a concept that's called creative placemaking, tactical urbanism, and wayfinding and stuff where you can actually put things into the built environment that artistically and culturally and creatively celebrate the stories that have been left out of the historical narrative. I put out these portals, which are places that you can go to for free and learn about a lot of the things that we're talking about right now. What is going to end up happening if our new mayor allows the most bright, brilliant minds to steer the ship, and if the tone-deaf ones back down and go to sleep a little bit so we can control the narrative a little bit more, then we're going to have a vibrant, very forward-thinking, innovative city. So please, if you know somebody who is tone-deaf, can you please tell them to stand down and go to sleep so we can take over and do something awesome here in the city. Mic drop.
I'd love to hear more. I'd love to hear more about those plans personally, but I was just going to say that I think, part of the continued defense of those monuments is that they are part of our history, right? And I think this just speaks to the deep level of denial going on here. I do think it would be really interesting and important to have conversations about this. I mean, I think that this is part of the unmasking, right? This is part of the process of educating people about what those monuments are really to, like who we are celebrating and what those people did. I mean, to those of us who are who have studied that part of the history or tuned in to that history, we're well aware. But I think there are a lot of people that are just not ready to face what exactly those monuments mean to a huge percentage of our population. And I'm not saying that like having the conversation should mean that we don't take them down. I mean, I do think that they should come down, and I think there's appropriate places where they could be displayed, like in a museum somewhere. Maybe the Museum of the Confederacy, or there's appropriate places where they could go.
There is no Museum of the Confederacy anymore.
Well, okay. Well, it
isn't.
still exists in a form.
It's the American Civil War Center, isn't it?
Well, they're combined, right?
Yeah.
So maybe one of them could go in there. I mean, I think they're appropriate. I would love to hear her ideas too. I don't have some great answer about where they should go, but to the question about whether they should be on our monument, no, I think they should come down, and I think having a public discussion about it would really be important and valued.
Yeah, I too am a UVA grad, and that's really I'm not a Richmonder. My introduction into the Commonwealth was through Charlottesville, and I live in Richmond now. I'm not gonna weigh in on this. Believe it or not, as the resident historian, I'm gonna cop out. No, but I'm gonna say something as an observer. And I've said this before publicly, and I'm gonna say it again. Every time we start talking about the monuments, it's like throwing Miracle-Gro on the city's character flaws, right? Every time. And it brings out, it's the same conversation over and over, right? It brings out this, it draws out the worst in Richmond is what I've seen as an outsider. And we end up in the same place with this conversation over the monuments. And in many ways, it's not that dissimilar to the conversations this city has about slavery, right? It just it seems to bring out the requisite voices from either side of the particular issue. I'm copping out on an answer, but as an observer, I find it interesting that I've been in this city for 6 years, and the conversation has changed very little in the 6 years that I've been here about those monuments, and in some ways about slavery.
I would just point out, too, I think it's important to know that the city does not have jurisdiction over all the statues. The state owns the Lee Monument. So if you're so good luck on that. My institution curates that art collection, which that is part of. So it's a little bit different problem if you're gonna do something with Lee. But, I mean, my view is really that this is one of the few grand boulevards that exist in the United States. It really is. It's artistically a really remarkable place. The ideology that built it, I have no interest, in defending, obviously. But at the same time, it at least should be interpreted correctly. That would be my main thing as a historian. Let's actually talk about what these statues really do mean. I'm also personally not all that crazy about the memorialization of war. That's a problem for me too. I went to the Air and Space Museum, and the one that's out by Dulles Airport, and they have the Enola Gay with a little plaque that says it's a B, whatever it is, 24. Doesn't tell you that it killed hundreds of thousands of people. I have a real problem with that too.
You're trivializing generations of people that were lost,
yes,
right?
Yes.
Yeah, right.
The best Confederate monument in Virginia, I think, is the pyramid in Hollywood Cemetery, because it's about loss. And not surprisingly, women built it. It is, without a doubt. It's an incredible piece, I think. And it's not all that other crap.
The question is fascinating, and one of the words that's used is about remembering history. Well, the thing is, most people don't know the history.
Right.
When the monuments were erected in between 1890 and 1929, that was the nadir for black people. That was the lowest point. That's when people were being lynched on a daily basis. The NAACP office, Ida B. Wells, would put out a sign every day that they learned about a lynching. Those are when those monuments were erected. Now, I have a different opinion about whether they should be removed. I think we need to keep them there. We need to learn from them. We need to look at Richmond as a museum itself. The museum is not just in a building, but it's the landscape. And those monuments, those statues on Monument Avenue, say something not only about the people during that time, but about contemporary history as well. How are we interpreting those monuments? We're really not doing a good job about that at all. That's what we really need to address.
It was also a bit of a real estate ploy, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was
pretty much.
Yeah. That was the suburbs when they built.
That's exactly right.
It's a lost causism to the nth degree, and they built a neighborhood around this identity with the lost cause. It didn't exist there before, if I'm not mistaken.
No, you're absolutely right about that.
On the periphery of the city, and
Yes, yeah, it was just totally a real estate ploy, and that's why it's where Lee is, the first monument.
Yeah, and that's about 1888. You have to consider the
Yeah.
politics at that time.
Right.
I think the more important question is, why don't we have a statue to John Mitchell?
Yeah.
Let me just say, for real, it should be at this point about building up what you love instead of bashing what you hate. So the statues are there, but I mean, I can think of fabulous people like John Mitchell Jr., your dude, yeah, who was all about indie media success and was the curator and the editor of the Richmond Planet newspaper, whose logo was a black fist with lightning bolts coming off of the top of it to talk about black excellence coming out of Richmond, Virginia, permeating throughout the universe, Ashe. So, I say all that to say, build up what you love and don't worry about bashing what you hate. Leave the statues, build something extraordinary for the next generation.
What really bothers me in this thing is, I would personally stand in front of the Lee Monument and protect it if somebody would build me a new Armstrong High School and properly fund it.
Word.
So I think I think what's really important, and honestly this is true all over the South and all over America, is we fight for these symbolic victories while we leave the horrible heritage and destruction in place. And I'm serious about that. I mean, Armstrong has the lowest test scores in the state. It's just because you've got this concentration of very distressed people, underfunded, undersupported, and people just leave these kids there. These are just kids. And we do this as a matter of course. You know, I'll ride, you know, Jeb Stuart's horse. You know?
All right, on that note, on that note, we're going to open it up to one question. We have time for one question from the audience. Anybody has a question? Quick question, okay? Oh, hold on. Need a microphone.
While you're doing that, let me mention that there was recently an exhibit at Diversity Richmond called Truthful History Heals about the monument, and gave different perspectives of each of the people figured in those monuments.
So I did hear a lot this evening about transportation and housing, and you just turned the corner to my question, which is about education and the inequities therein. And then again, I've just heard a lot of process problems this evening. The process by which things happen is really skewed to create disadvantage. So describe a process by which trust in the educational system can be established in the face of what someone said is plain old lies in textbooks and systemic systems of punishment in the schools that reflect the slave catcher mentality and are designed to discourage public education for blacks or any questioning of the status quo. So what kind of process? I mean, because we can't just shut them down and go, okay, wait, we got to start over and do something different. So what kind of process?
I'm going to go at this from a personal level instead of an academic. I live in the city of Richmond, and my daughter, we've decided to keep my daughter in Richmond Public Schools. She goes to John B. Carey. And I've seen firsthand pretty much everything you just articulated. And the way that we've dealt with this on an interpersonal level is to get in that school, right, and take over the PTA.
Right.
So you know, it's a big question, but the general reality is anybody who could get out of the Richmond Public Schools over the last 30 years got out. And the folks who couldn't get out are still there. And what's happened is that the state basically funds the same amount of money for Armstrong that it does for Deep Run. So you just figure it out. It doesn't take a lot of brain science to do this. And I know, because national statistics will tell you, that at that level of poverty, it takes 200% the resources to make it work. And the state gives less to that than it does to the suburban schools. I know exactly what can happen when you put the resources in. I know the humanity that can be restored. I know the sense of true learning that can occur. I deal with these kids every week myself. You know, it's not rocket science. And the state of Virginia has maintained this level of discrimination in an incredible way, and it's really distressing.
I just want to know, like, why, if you know this and you have white privilege and you're a man, why haven't things gotten better at the Armstrong you love so much?
Well,
does it really take you riding that horse?
Actually, they have gotten better, but my white privilege is limited. I mean, I've got a
Don't
lot
you have
of
some
it.
friends?
I still have the mic, so I'm just going to say that.
But thank you for asking.
With limited white privilege, I have in fact seen, because first of all, your strategy that you described is exactly what I did with my daughter's middle school, like just commandeered it almost. But but at the same time, the white privilege tends to be reduced the more closely you become associated with oppressed people. And that's just something that I've determined, that there are white people who are incredibly helpful, but can face limited effectiveness because they are too closely associated with oppressed people.
I want to just give one quick historical point here, too, that I think is really important. And no, again, people don't get this, is if it wasn't for African Americans, Virginia would never even have had a damn public education system.
That's right.
Because the 1870 Constitution was what created it, and guess what? And that was the first, those were the...
Black public school, first public school in, what was it, in the nation?
Not in the nation, but in Virginia, there was no system before the 1870 Constitution, and it was the influence of African American legislators and in that constitutional convention that made that happen. So.
And I want to add as well that it's important that when we talk about academic excellence, that we also keep in mind culturally responsive pedagogy, right? So when we're dealing with our children who are experiencing trauma on a daily basis within the school system, we can't ignore that. That has to be at the forefront of our minds as school administrators, as parents, as aunts and uncles and community members and teachers and professors, et cetera, that these kids cannot just flip a switch and then come to school and be okay. Because some of them are not eating breakfast in the morning, right? Some of them may not have lunch or dinner at home. So it's important that we understand that while we constantly, as we should, promote academic excellence, and scholastic achievement, we have to understand where these children, the dilemmas and the destructive, I want to say, social paradigms that they all, for the most part, exist in. And so how can we meet them where they are and figure out the best way to reach out to them? And I know that, the ratio when it comes to teacher-student ratio, sometimes it's out of hand, especially in lots of our RPS schools, right? So it's very difficult for a teacher to meet a child one-on-one when you have a huge classroom to deal with and it's just one teacher inside the classroom. But I think if we looked at this holistically, with the school board, with the new mayor, as community members, as active community members who are always in the schools, always in the faces of the people who make a decision, then it'll make a difference. And I want to say also that it's important for us to be at the table, not just at the table, but to actually have a hand and a voice in the decision-making process. Because sometimes being at the table can be a mask, right? So we have a person at the table, but are they actually having a say-so when it comes to the decisions that are being made? So I think that's something that we have to constantly keep our eyes on and stay engaged as much as we possibly can.
Okay. We also have to try to figure out how to address this private school pipeline where white students just start off in the private schools here and never give public schools a chance and therefore are completely disengaged from the system. I mean, that's something I address a little bit in my book about Prince Edward County, and I think there are a lot of parallels. After the schools were closed in Prince Edward, whites were invested in the private school, and they never really went fully back to the public school system. Well, I see so many parallels here that many white children here start off in the private schools, and so when they come back and have their own kids, they assume that the private schools are the only option for them. And so we need to really work, through our friendships and personal relationships to show that RPS schools are thriving and to encourage, not only to encourage people to try the public schools, but also to stay in the public schools, not just to quit at elementary school and move on to the private school, but in order to do that, we need to show them that the middle schools have options for them, and we need to provide better options for high school for all of our children, But I think getting whites invested in the public school system by sending their kids there would really help to make it better for everybody, as sad as that is to say.
Well, as much as I don't want to stop this conversation, we're going to have to take a quick 15-minute break. We've talked about Richmond's past. When we come back after 15 minutes, we're going to talk more about Richmond's present. So start thinking about those questions. Enjoy some of this good Shindig's food, and we'll see you right back here in 15 minutes. So we have a new panel of panelists, well, except for one. Greg Kemble has decided to come back. He just couldn't get enough, so he's back at the table. But let me introduce the panelists for this discussion. We have Thad Williamson. Please raise your hand, Thad. We have Dr. Tressie McMillan Cottom, Ted Lewis, Tasha Chambers, Dr. John Meeser, and Mark Cheatham. Give our panelists a round of applause. And all of their bios are listed in your programs tonight, so you can read a little bit more about them. I do want to ask our panelists, please remember to speak up and speak loudly for our people, especially in the back. I've been told that some of them are having a few problems hearing some of the answers tonight, so please just speak up. I will start with just a little 30-second response that I want to this question. What astounds you? Same question that I asked earlier. Greg, we already kind of know what astounds you in what you study, but just talk a little bit about what astounds you when it comes to Richmond and your area of expertise.
Expertise is a stretch. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it, but
Okay.
it is a stretch. No, I think what really stands out to me, and it kind of started off the first panel this way, right? Until you got to the question about the Confederate statues, that I felt like, because I know a lot of the people on the first panel, and I know their personalities, and I know, how they talk with each other, and how we communicate and conversate. And I think one of the things that always astounds me is how long it takes before we can pull each other into our living room, right, and have an honest conversation about our current situation, our current times, when we're talking about race and the factors that come associated with race. So, I mean, like everything else, like I said, the first panel is a really good example because you have some really dynamic personalities. And it really took, I think most of you would hopefully notice and agree, that it really took that question where it really started to feel like, okay, now I'm coming into the living room and I'm starting to really understand what people were feeling and thinking and so forth. And so, I think what happens in a lot of communities, in Richmond in particular, is that we don't have enough of those living room conversations with people that don't look like us, that don't know our backgrounds and don't make our family situations, like just don't know us. And what happens is until we really start having those living room conversations, those unfiltered, and with the understanding that, we can kind of agree to disagree on some things, we'll find common ground on some things, but the really core, honest, kind of non-polite dialogue that everyone really needs to have, it astounds me that it takes this long, right? It takes this long, and it takes these events, and it takes an event in Richmond that really shouldn't have happened for us to even start this series, right? So it takes a very long time for us to really start having those honest dialogues, and it really does. It still surprises me how much people don't know about each other and how hard it is to bring them into your world.
Panelists, please give your name and title.
Name and title, and 30 seconds. I was just trying to be nice about it, but okay, go on. Right.
30 seconds for a classroom teacher.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Here we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, well, it's a challenge to speak in 30 seconds as a college professor who is programmed to speak in 50-minute intervals. But I'm going to keep it short. Two things that astound me are two movements that are occurring in Richmond. I would call them mega movements. They've never happened before, but the implications are enormous. And I would also say this is happening not only in Richmond, it's happening across the United States. Number one, the growth of the city's population for the first time really since the end of the Second World War. Income is going up in Richmond for the first time in that period. The other movement is people living in poverty going to the suburbs. This is very different than post-World War II suburbanization, when people went there by choice to buy a home. This shift is not one made because of choice. It rather comes because there is no choice. The whole social geography of Richmond is being changed. For so long, we have thought of Richmond, certainly again since the Second World War, and that's really kind of the period that I have stayed, as a city that had a huge outmigration of whites to the suburbs, and income was going down. And the suburbs represented wealth. And to draw this to a close, the reason that you laugh, I know, I feel stupid in having said that, because but what's happening is that poverty is still very high and highly concentrated in the city of Richmond, but because of the first movement, the population going up, these are the millennials coming back into the city, living in places like North Churchill, and it's increasing rents to the point that people who have lived in apartments can no longer live there because they can't afford the rents. And the abundance of affordable housing now is in the older suburbs. It's not necessarily standard housing. One reason the rents are lower is because it's most often substandard. But at least it provides an affordable rent. Maybe we can talk about this a little bit more, but the combination of these two forces really is quite enormous. We're looking much more like third world countries. Historically, third world countries, the cities have been the center of wealth, and poverty has been concentrated in the ghettos, the favelas, the shanty towns on the outskirts of the city. That is exactly the social geography of Richmond. In fact, for the first time ever, there are more people living in poverty who reside in the suburbs now than in the city of Richmond.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tressie. I'm sociologist, professor, author, etc. Okay. There are two quick things I think you should know about me. I am new-ish still to Richmond, and that's going to, I think, influence a lot about how I understand what is happening in Richmond. And the second thing you should know is that as a sociologist, I'm always steeped in history, but I am, as a sociologist, usually more concerned with current social problems, both their historical antecedents, but I'm also, by virtue of the work that I do, tend to be concerned with where we're going, right? So I think that might be why I'm here today. So when I come here as a new person to Richmond, I'm now starting in my second year. I do what most black people do. First, I started trying to find a place to get my hair done, but then after I got rid of that issue, the second issue is I was trying to find the heart of the African-American community in Richmond, right? I'm a sociologist. I tend to deal in demography and numbers, so I go and I look for the demographic statistics, and I see the trends that John has described, right? So I know by income data patterns that there should be a growing black middle class in Richmond, according to the demographic data. So I start looking for our institutional homes, our institutional wealth, because I'm trying to map my personal social geography onto the city of Richmond's social geography. And so what has astounded me in doing that process is sort of reading myself through the sociology of this place and the sociology of my work. I study higher education and inequality, race, class, and gender in the new economy, has been trying to read myself through that data. So as I've been experiencing it as a newcomer, has been this, There's not much shocking about the historical trends of racial inequality in the city. They are built on the same sort of racial patterns that we have that we discussed in the first part of the panel. Most of them tied increasingly to the wealth inequality that emerges out of the racial stratification and racial hierarchy, and that's why we can now see class-based interventions that just replicate the same racial inequalities, and that's where we kind of are in this current moment. But to see how those things are changing and how it's happening at every level of institution. So not only do we have residential segregation increasingly determining the life chances of a child in the city of Richmond based on what neighborhood they live in, the quality of the neighborhood that they will live in, but most importantly these days, what schools they will attend, right? We now see that even if they graduate, which they are less likely to do than a white student in the city of Richmond, but even if the typical African-American student in this city graduates on time, they're more likely to graduate from a school ill-prepared to meet the minimum standards for admission to the state flagship public university, the system that their parents have paid tax dollars into for all of their young lives. They won't meet the minimum admissions requirements. So that greatly constrains where they can go to college, even if they are culturally well prepared for school. They start out at a disadvantage. They're more likely to go to a less selective institution if they go at all. And then with my work, they're more likely to go to a very unselective institution like a for-profit college, which puts them at a great disadvantage of going into the lower end of the labor market and staying grounded in Richmond in the poorest, worst quality jobs, which are expected to increase in the new economy and to be disproportionately populated by African American and Hispanic Americans. So it says to me that while history matters, we're still replicating it. So I came back to my question. What astounds me the most is that after all of this time, we're still asking the same questions.
Good evening. I'm Thad Williamson. I'm a professor, a political scientist at the University of Richmond. I've also worked in City Hall most recently and currently as the transition director for Mayor LeVar Stoney. I've been here since 2005, and what astounds me now is when Adrian and I came here, we had no idea that we would find Richmond to actually be the best place to be in the entire country, to be on the front lines of fighting for social justice. And I actually believe that's the case. This is the best place to be right now. Virginia is the epicenter, national politics. Richmond is a relatively small town, you may have heard. There's a sense of possibility. You can do things here if you push and move. And I think one thing that astounds me, builds into that, is that almost all the issues we've talked about tonight, historical issues, are well understood by everybody in City Hall, and it's actually been official policy for a number of years to try to roll back some of those things. Transportation being the leading edge, this ridiculous system that cuts off at the city limits, more or less, trying to envision actual change there, making a little bit of progress. Understanding the historical forces that led to the concentration of public housing solely in the city and mostly in one part of the city. Okay, understanding the racialized system of education we have, understanding the Dillon rule Professor Hayter mentioned. People in City Hall have known that for a while and have actually built policies and institutionalized programs based on that understanding. The challenge is two things. One is not enough people know that and understand it. And second, just because you know it doesn't mean you can fix it very easily. This stuff was designed to be hard to undo. We have a new mayor who wants to build on that. And I firmly believe he's 100% committed to social justice, and I think there's going to be some stuff to be really excited about. But all of us in this room have to do our part to help make it happen, and part of it means shedding the cynicism, shedding this, we're Richmond, we don't do stuff like that. We can do it, and we will do it, and that's what I'm astounded about.
Can you hear me? Yes. Good evening. I'm Tasha Chambers, and I am the director of the Black History Museum and Cultural Center of Virginia. First, thank you for having me. This has been a wonderful and much-needed series. So what astounds me, well, I guess I can give a little backstory. I'll try to keep it very quick, Samantha. I see you grilling me over here. So, when I started at the Black History Museum, I got a lot of very nice and friendly correspondences from people, especially young black women, asking, like, where'd you come from? Like, we never heard of you before you got in this position. Like, how did you get this position? And the funny and I guess kind of sad thing about it is that I've been in Richmond except for the 4 years that I went to Howard University. And I've always worked for large companies in Richmond or organizations that really didn't have a Richmond focus, like they thought more globally. And so I had to like introduce myself to Richmond. So I feel like I've been on a speed date with Richmond. I've gotten to know so many of you like in 5 minutes or less. But you know, it's really interesting, you know, to hear those questions that people ask. So where'd you come from? And you know, just things like that. When you know, black women make up 71% of those getting master's degrees and more than 60% of those earning bachelor's degrees. And yet I'm getting questions like, where'd you come from and how'd you get this position? Like the better question is, why aren't we in these positions? So that is what is astounding me as a 35-year-old professional, that as a black woman, and I know that we're the forerunners, the front runners in earning doctoral degrees and masters and bachelors, that we still are not CEOs and directors of organizations and companies. That's a problem.
So good evening, my name is Ted Lewis. I work for an organization called Side by Side. Some of you may know us as RoseMe. We work with lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and questioning youth ages 11 to 20, and we've done so in Richmond for over 25 years. To give you a tiny bit of context, I grew up in Vienna, Virginia. Some of you consider that part of Virginia, some of you don't. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. I grew up with a white mother. My mother married who I consider my father, my stepfather, who's black, at the age of 2. So I grew up in a multiracial household in Virginia in the 80s. So I come with a specific context of sort of my growing up. When I moved to Richmond, my father said I had lost my damn mind. And my mother agreed. It was worse because I used to live in South Carolina. So Virginia was a progressive move up. What astounds me most about Richmond is that race, and in particular white supremacy, is the most ubiquitous thing that runs through our city, and it is the most ignored thing that runs through our city. And to give you an idea, this is a Southern phrase that I have heard in Richmond a lot. It's the idea of the late unpleasantries. Have you heard of this before? This is how particularly white society women will refer to the Civil War. So if you were to talk to some white folks, the Civil War happened like 2 years ago. But slavery, we add an extra 100 years to how long ago that ended every year. So slavery ended thousands of years ago. We need to forget about that. But the Civil War, my daddy fought in that, and we got to protect it, right? And so, honestly, I live on the boulevard, so I talk to the flaggers on a pretty regular basis. And they firmly believe that the war of northern aggression is not over. It's not. So I think that there is what astounds me about Richmond is that, and I think the late unpleasantries is a good way to think of it. I also think that we are at a part in our history and our current moment where, in particular, working with young people who are no longer ready to be the polite Southerners, and in particular, polite people of color to say yes, please, and may I, and can I. I am witnessing young people approach this work with an intersectional lens that is saying, I'm going to become the director, and if I can't be the director there, I'm going to make my own. And that is much needed in our community, and it's definitely happening already. I agree with Thad about this piece that there is not a better place I feel like I could be in this moment than Richmond. And I am inspired by the young people in this city. And when I say young people, I don't just mean the college students, who I do love, but I don't just mean our college students. I mean the students at Armstrong High School. I mean the students at Huguenot High School that I get to see at Side by Side. If I can listen to an 11-year-old define intersectionality, we're gonna be all right.
All right, very nice. You see, we have another great group of panelists, so let's get to this first question. And remember, try to limit your answers to 2 minutes. Basically, what you just did. Okay.
No, we dig it.
All right, first question. In what ways do the effects of discriminatory housing policies still manifest in present-day Richmond? And this is open to any panelist. In what ways do the effects of discriminatory housing policies still manifest in present-day Richmond?
Can anybody name a way that it doesn't? I was about to say it's such a big one yeah, so based on like the kind of work that I do, that's a big one, but I tend to usually look at it through education. So
Okay.
of course, it's the number one driver of residential segregation, and which is a consequence of historical discrimination in housing. You can generally, so we talked a lot today about the highway running through Jackson Ward, which of course was again a national project. It destroyed highways, the U.S. highway system destroyed black wealth centers all across the country, of course. But it's always interesting to me in my class that we look at historical maps of black and white wealth in Richmond, and it's pretty easy to trace the movement of people in the city based on 100-year-old maps, right? That speaks to the sort of the stability of sort of wealth inheritance and how it continues to sort of define contemporary racial inequality. So it drives just about everything. Where you live, which drives our political choices, drives, again, the conversation that we've had about transportation, which drives investment, which tends to drive things like where jobs are located, where services are located. But I think the number one driver when we want to talk about the inheritability of either inequality or wealth, which is generally what you're either going to get. You're born and you're either born into wealth or you're born into the opposite of wealth. And those are the flip side of the same coin. You usually don't have because somebody else does, right? But the number one driver of that is what we can pass on to our children, and the number one thing we can tend to pass on to them usually is knowledge acquisition and social networks, the kinds of which they get in school. So our number is, I think the biggest way it shows up is the continued patterns of racial discrimination and inequality in our public school system, and actually the school system overall. And I would say that doesn't just stop at K through 12. I mean, in this state, we still don't equally fund historically black colleges in this state. We haven't matched dollar for dollar like we are obligated to do by federal law for our historically black colleges in the state since 2010. And that was only after doing it for about 5 years. We hadn't done it before that for about 10 or 15. I mean, we do this from K through 16 for our African American students. And as our black institutions increasingly serve new immigrant families, like non-American, non-black American immigrants and Hispanic Americans, we just continue to pass that off to other racial minorities. So I think that's one of the number one ways that it shows up in our sort of day-to-day experience of inequality.
I'll just add, I gave you the optimistic story, but there's also the cold reality. I mean, it's a bitter reality that economists have basically shown Richmond is one of the worst 50 counties in the entire United States to grow up if you're low income. 50 out of 2,500, the bottom 2%, in terms of your chances of rising if you're born low income. And it's because the factors multiply upon one another: the school situation, the lack of housing-based wealth, the lack of access to transportation, especially as jobs have suburbanized, the lack of access to social networks to people who have jobs and have information about jobs, as well as the loss of the manufacturing economy. All those things happening at the same time, multiplied by a political system that has locked city residents in different ways, and a state set of policies that basically have been not responsive. So the short answer is, as you said at the beginning, pretty much everything, as Alan said, pretty much everything is influenced by this.
Affordable housing, it is a crisis in the suburbs. You want to generate conflict, talk about creating affordable housing in an upper middle income neighborhood. There is nothing more explosive. There is nothing that will generate more pushback than housing. What is also desperately needed is not just more affordable housing, but we need mixed income neighborhoods. We need neighborhoods where people of all income levels can live. And I suspect right up there with more affordable housing in middle to upper middle and certainly an upper income neighborhood, right up there with it, that will create enormous opposition is looking at ways that you can integrate the schools by changing zoning or by going to mixed income neighborhoods that then would lead to integrated schools. People are passionate about where their children go to school. And the resistance to this day to integrated schools is mind-boggling. We are more segregated. Our schools are more segregated across the United States. Our schools are more segregated now than they were prior to the Brown decision. Brookings Institution has indicated that about 53% of all the children in the United States are on free and reduced fare lunch. This is magnified enormously here in Richmond. The good news I bring to you tonight is that a few years ago, the Richmond region, and it includes more localities than the Richmond Regional Planning District. That includes 8 localities if you don't count Ashland, the city, and the counties. But even more so than that, pulled down a sizable state grant to create a regional magnet school for this area. Now, the magnet school is not designed to be like the governor's school. This is going to be a regular school. But here is what is exciting. This school will be purposely structured so that there will be a certain proportion of the student body who come from low-income neighborhoods. It is designed explicitly to mix students by income. If that, and it's going to happen. It's going to happen. And what will happen once that school is built, if all of the studies that we know about hold true, that the children in that magnet school who live in impoverished neighborhoods will do far better. Their achievement will go up. And meanwhile, the achievement level of children from high wealth neighborhoods will not be retarded one bit.
All right, we're going to have to move on to the next question.
And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Oh, I'm going to have to put on my mom voice. Panelists, please, 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 we thank you for your knowledge and your wisdom here tonight, but it's important to us that our audience also gets to ask questions. So please be respectful of the time limit. Please try to limit your answers to 2 minutes or less. Thank you.
Mom has spoken. All right, next question. Speak to how artists and creatives of color influence Richmond's overall culture. Actually, I'm on the wrong question. Let me go back. How have Richmond's race relations and the struggle for civil rights mirrored the local LGBTQ community's civil and human rights efforts? In what ways do these subjects converge?
So, a little in my wheelhouse, I'm gonna try.
Okay.
And I'm watching 2 minutes.
Yes.
So, I'm going to start to answer this question by sort of talking about how it is, in my opinion, impossible to talk about these as if they're the same thing. So I want to be very clear. I'm not talking about race relations and LGBTQ rights as if you can make a one-to-one comparison. The other reality is, if you look at the history of the LGBTQ rights movement across the country, but in particular in Richmond, if you are a white cisgender man and you come out later in life, you have amassed your wealth and your network and your connections to a point, and then you have come out as an other to a community that already knows you as a person. And so the minute they try to dehumanize you, it's like, wait a minute, right? So I'll give you an example that's easier to think about. It was Ellen DeGeneres is the reason that same-sex marriage is okay. Because people were upset that gay people could get married, but they were really mad that Ellen couldn't, right? So if I have known Ellen as a person for years, and she's in my country club and in my class and everything, the minute she comes out as gay, we're already integrated. LGBTQ people are already part of your neighborhood. We're already there. So the idea that you can sort of ghettoize LGBTQ people as a separate group and segregate them in society is just not possible. So that's, I would say, is the biggest reason that you cannot do a one-to-one comparison, right? It does not mean that LGBTQ people are not oppressed, right? I'm not trying to say that at all. The other piece about this is when we talk about the convergence, LGBTQ people of color do exist. So we cannot act as if they are completely separate, right? There are black gay people, right? And so they exist. And when I talked before about people making their own, there are groups like Southerners on New Ground in the area, Nations Foundation, Minority Health Consortium, URGC, and Pastor Lisette Cross, who's here, who works side by side with me, as well as Restoration Fellowship Church. We're talking today about sort of why do you create your own, and we love this idea of you're tired of being talked about instead of being talked with. Right? And the last piece I want to throw out in my 2 minutes is how does religion fit into both the liberation possibilities of both race relations and the LGBTQ movement, and how has religion demonized people of color and LGBTQ people in our history? And not just our history, but our present. And I'm going to give you an extreme example, so because I'm about to quote the Ku Klux Klan of Virginia, of Martinsville, Virginia, which is not of 1910, of 2017. Okay? The loyal white knights of the Ku Klux Klan of Martinsville, Virginia, our goal is to help restore America to a white Christian nation founded on God's word. This does not mean that we want to see anything bad happen to the darker races. We simply want to live separate from them as God intended. Leviticus 20:24-25. A couple verses before that is the verse that talks about you should not lay man with, it's one of the Bible thumper verses around homosexuality. If we really want to dig in my opinion, about intersectionality in the South, and we want to talk about race, we have to continue to acknowledge that the most segregated hour in America is 11 a.m. on Sunday. And that's not just talking about race anymore. And so to recognize that in 2017, the life expectancy of a black trans woman in the United States is 35 years old, because when you are a person of color and transgender, that means your life is not worth the same. 35 years old. That's how old I am right now. And some of you are looking at me like I'm a baby, right? If I was a black trans woman, I would now be exceeding my life expectancy.
All right. Next question. Now, speak to how artists and creatives of color influence Richmond's overall culture. Does the work of these individuals receive enough attention or support in the wider community? Why or why not?
Okay. So I think there is no safer place than art to have like some type of honest conversation. So I think that's what really gives artists of color an opportunity to, I think, kind of have a level playing field there. So I do feel like an artist probably has a little bit more freedom, and I guess those who are connoisseurs of art probably give a little bit of, that's like I think the place where they're actually able to, I guess what am I looking to say? Like, it's through art that people are open to have certain conversations. So to me, I feel like art is one of those industries where race isn't necessarily a big factor, because I feel like when you're being creative and you're being artsy, those who are buying your art, they're not really looking to have those deep conversations because it's the art that's really speaking for itself. So for me, what I've seen at the Black History Museum, the people who are coming through the doors for the types of exhibitions that we're having, like we had Romare Bearden, and we had so many white folks coming through the doors to see Bearden, because it's in that place where people aren't really looking to have like really deep, serious conversations, or at the same time, it's like that paradox where they're able to have those conversations. So for me, I'm seeing that artists actually are more accepted. But then at the same time, if you're looking at Basquiat, like, he was exploited. So then I guess now I'm kind of like talking in circles. But I would see more contemporary art. What I'm seeing is that's a safe place. So I'm not seeing that at the Black History Museum, where race is really impacting our artists or artists of color. And I'm actually seeing museums actually doing all that they can to bring black folks through the doors. That's what I'm seeing here in Richmond. Like you're seeing Kehinde Wiley at VMFA. You're seeing It's Our Relative at the Valentine. So I think, our white allies are seeing the value of what we're bringing to the table, in artistry and also from historical context. So as I try to bring this all back together, because it started off a little bumpy, that, people see the value in art. And again, it's one of those safe places where race isn't really an issue. And again, these museums are seeing the value in the Black dollar. So they're bringing exhibitions to Richmond to get Black folks in the door. So that's something that's very telling. And that's something also, as the director of the Black History Museum, that we need to really make sure that we're maximizing, that we're not losing our space in Richmond to some of these majority institutions who see our work, something that we've been seeing for 35 years.
Okay. Well, much of the discussion about Richmond's Renaissance centers on attracting millennials and young professionals. More often than not, these terms are used exclusively to refer to white millennials and white young professionals. Are political and business leaders doing enough to attract and cultivate a healthy middle professional class of people of color?
I should have answered that question.
I think the answer. I want somebody to ask Mark a question.
Go on.
But I'll go ahead and I think the answer to that question is it's
Yeah.
Richmond Public Schools. That's the answer. When people have confidence in Richmond Public Schools, that will happen. African American middle class will come back. And how you do that is a hard question with a lot of different moving pieces. But I always say on that, we got to start at the beginning. We got to start with the 0 to 3 and getting kids ready for pre-K and kindergarten and trying to offset a lot of the trauma that our kids are exposed to. But when RPS is thriving and is seen to be thriving, the middle class will be back.
Okay.
Okay. I will say, because in regards to attracting millennials of color, one of the things that is a challenge in Richmond is just the number of people of color that are CEOs and executives and in positions to hire millennials to come to their companies and have companies large enough to do so. One of the things, I think that's an issue, and I've actually spoken to a lot of, in particular in the Black community, I've spoken to a lot of Black CEOs and a lot of Black executives trying to figure out, what can they do to bring in more young professionals and people of color and do so. And I think that on a larger scale, I don't know if this particularly answers the question, but it's important for, I think, the group to know, is that what I found talking to a lot of African American Black CEOs in particular, is that they're really, really good at hard work. Like, they are working 20 out of 24 hours a day, 22 out of 24 hours a day. I'm looking in the room, I see some of you, and they're really, really bad at networking, right? So while someone that may have a little bit more privilege may be able to knock off at 5 o'clock in their company and sit on a board or go to a networking event and be able to really grow the network of their business and do so, a lot of the executives and CEOs, in particular in the Black community, just don't have the luxury to do that. They're really working really hard. But what's really important is that networking piece is the difference between your company growing from, say, 50% to 100% and being able to hire young millennials that look like the CEO, right? Not saying that that's the universal answer in regards to, but when you're talking about attracting millennials, I think education does come first. I think public safety is a really big thing that we haven't really touched on today, because I will tell you this, it doesn't matter. I mean, it's less important how great the schools are. You could have amazing schools here if you don't feel safe. I think one of the things that's happened in Richmond is people started feeling safe first, and then they started focusing on schools. But I do think that building a pipeline through education and through having people of color run some of these businesses and having mentorship programs, which we do not have nearly enough of for people of color trying to be executives, trying to be CEOs, we need to have those types of programs in place, and they need to be inclusive and welcome young professionals of color so that there's a pipeline to educate them and get them more involved.
could I just add something? So we have about maybe three millennials here on this panel, and I'll just tell you my experience, and I'm just going to be very candid and super transparent. Yeah, we're family. You know, from my experience, you know, and that goes back to my, you know, what astounds me intro. You know, I, again, have been in Richmond all of my professional life, all of my life pretty much, and the fact that we have so very few millennials, particularly millennials of color, in leadership roles, it's really disturbing. It's super disturbing. And I have to say it, you may not like it, but I feel like there is a certain type of black that's acceptable at the top. There's a certain type of black that's accepted. It's a little, you know, and I feel like the people who I'm not speaking to, they know what that type of black is. And it's that black that's willing to speak up, be assertive, not assimilate. That type of black you may not find being a CEO. You may not find serving in a city position. You may not even find that type of black leading a diversity and inclusion initiative, because they're not going to give you what you want to hear. They're going to tell you what it really is. So if you don't show up in that certain kind of black, then you probably won't be the next CEO or executive director. And so that's a challenge, you know, and that goes back to true inclusion. So we can talk about diversity and inclusion, but that inclusion piece, oh, that's the piece. When we accept not only how people look differently, but how people think, that's also inclusion, how you make them feel comfortable. And, you know, Richmond, that's a big problem in the city, because I'm seeing a certain type of black being in those leadership positions. And it's no offense, because we need, you know, certain types of black, I guess, all across the board. But I would like to see that other type of black be in a position to lead. Just saying.
Promise you a sec. I'm fascinated by the idea that it's all RPS when we're in a college town. VCU, U of R, Virginia Union, there are multiple millennials who have college degrees, graduate degrees in our city right now. VCU is one of the most racially diverse campuses in Virginia, in the country. So we don't got to go anywhere. They're right down the street.
All right, good
Some of them
conversation.
here.
Well, the last mayoral election brought a candidate who built a winning coalition across some of the city's most diverse districts. In fact, age, not race, may have been the biggest predictor of whether someone voted for LeVar Stoney. Do you think the city's politics are less racially driven than ever?
No.
Right.
We all plead the fifth.
Yeah, this is. I mean, this mayor's race, which we covered a lot, and I guess we didn't say. I didn't do the introduction part as well as I want to. So, I run a blog in Richmond called the Cheats Movement that focuses on kind of it's the intersection of hip hop culture and civic engagement, right? Community engagement, and we covered a lot of this mayor's race in regards to having roundtables where we brought groups of diverse people. Civic leaders and community folks and a lot of different types of people around the table to have conversations about what the mayor's race was looking like and how it was shaping up. And I found this mayor's race to be absolutely fascinating because you had the ultimate winner, right? LeVar Stoney, who is the mayor now, and who's a 35-year-old at the time, African American. And then you also had Joe Morrissey and Jack Berry and John Blouse also, and Michelle Mosby. I think race played an extremely profound and extremely important part of this election, and you guys all know why. I think there's a whole number of factors, but from the very beginning, it was framed as Joe Morrissey's race to lose, right? And Joe Morrissey, a white man, right, was pulling, polling-wise, which pollings could be a little bit inaccurate at the end of the day, right, or a lot inaccurate at the end of the day. But long story short is, Joe Morrissey he was winning on all the polls because he was pulling all of his support from the black community, right? From basically the 5th district on down. And what I think happened, and there's obviously all these different theories, and Thad probably knows more about this, but what I saw on the ground was a couple of things. But one of the first things I saw was the black community basically saying, not on my dime. Joe Morrissey is not going to be elected, not on my dime. And I think there's an interesting thing about this is interesting as well, because there was a lot of talk about, obviously, John Blyles dropping out and so forth. I think I could be wrong, and I love John to death. He's a great individual, and he's just an amazing guy. I think John probably gets a little bit too much credit, and I don't think Michelle Mosby gets enough credit. Because Michelle Mosby was the person that said on air what a lot of the black community on the 5th District on down was saying when they ran those ads that said, I don't feel comfortable with Joe Morrissey, right, around my daughter. And what I think happened, there's a bunch of factors that happened, but I do think that race was extremely important. And I think it was extremely important because when the black community, when it was a kind of a universal, when it was a decision that, those districts were going to reject the Joe Morrissey brand in a large number, I think LeVar, in a lot of credit to him, he did a lot of things right and ran a very strong campaign, was in position to pick up those votes. And I think the other thing that happened, which was extremely fascinating, was just the power of the 2nd Congressional District in VCU. And I think there was a whole strategy that was built around possibly LeVar not winning the 2nd District, right? He wound up winning the 2nd District, but it was, but I think there was, let's get to a runoff and do a bunch of other things. But I do think that for the ultimate end, and I'm sorry, I've gone over my 2 minutes, I apologize, but the ultimate end of this election had a lot to do with a lot of people doing a lot of things right in regards to how they ran their races, but I don't think you can ignore the strength, and this is the way that was designed. The reason why you have to win 5 out of 9 is so that black people wouldn't have got ignored. That's how it was when they put in the charter. So I think race had a big part to play in this election.
Y'all could have all broken in my bank accounts by using my password 23567. That was the coalition LeVar pulled that nobody thought was possible and broke all the rules. So that's significant. I think it speaks for itself. But I want to, the election's over. I think the governance question is more interesting. And let's roll back to Professor Hader's wheelhouse. Compare what LeVar Stoney, climate he faces in governing the city compared to what Henry Marsh had to work with. That was extremely polarized, racialized city. He was more or less completely stonewalled by the white business community when he tried to exercise any autonomy, starting with getting a new city manager, and called on the carpet, all kinds of pressure put on that first majority black council. So we have to think about that to answer the question appropriately. There's no question race is significant, but it's a completely different ballgame compared to what it was. And then to really answer the question, you have to obviously go back even further to Professor Meeser's book, Politics of Annexation, which should be required reading for everyone in Richmond, because he tells a story about how we got into this structural mess in the 60s as a basically deliberate power play by white elites trying to hold on to power, and created the mess that we're still left with and starting to undo.
Just kind of follow up to what you're talking about. Can you anyway speak to what I would call new racial?
Okay, we have, before we get to the audience questions, we have one more question for our panelists. Define race as a social construct and apply it to today's Richmond.
I say that's a setup. Well, the first thing you should know is I teach a class, and it takes us about 14 weeks to get through half of what that question just said. But if you'd ever like to come take it, describe race as a social construct. Mm-hmm. Well, okay. This is what we mean when we say race is. I'll give you my 101. This is what we mean when we say race is a social construct. It does not mean that race is not real, right? Almost everything that we do is socially constructed. What gives race its power and its meaning are the various social interactions that we attribute to race, right? That's what we mean when we say it is socially constructed. There is no biological gene for race, right? There is a genetic expression that makes us look different, that is related to our genetic histories, but the idea of race actually does not come down from heaven, no matter what they say in Leviticus. He, of course, was talking about, they were, of course, talking about religious denominations. They were not meaning race the way that we talk about it, but don't tell that to the flaggers. But yeah, so that's what we mean when we say it's a social construction. It does not mean that it's not real. It's actually probably one of the most powerful constructions we have. Deeply entwined with gender being the other very powerful one, which we haven't talked quite so much about how those things intersect, race and class and gender, and all those things are really given racist meaning all of the time. But gender is another one that's very powerful social construction. Again, doesn't mean they aren't real, but that we give them a lot of meaning. It shapes where we live. It shapes who we love, right? It shapes who we mate with. It shapes who we have children with. It shapes how we vote. It shapes how we decide who is us and who is them. And that is fundamentally what we're talking about when we talk about the allocation of resources. What's acceptable for other people's children as opposed to mine, and whether or not I think that is the same value that I hold for my own political position. Race is always shaping those things. Everything from our most intimate decisions to our own sense of ourselves, to how we vote, to where we work, to how we spend our money. So that's what we mean when we say it's a social construction. How does it shape Richmond? It shapes Richmond the way it now shapes the entire world. Race, the racial hierarchy, this idea that there is a naturally superior race and every other so-called racial group falls under it in this hierarchical stratification, shapes the entire society, global society, mostly through global capitalism, but that's a whole other thing. You should also know that I run far left, even to my good friends here, but we won't go there. But so it shapes Richmond in the same way that it shapes the entire world. I mean, right, again, it shapes where we live. The fact that I can be a new person to Richmond and I can get out of the car and I can ask, where do the black people live? And someone can tell me. Yeah. Right? Yeah. When I know that I'm not going to be able to get the same food at the Martins on my side of town that I get at the one across town, right? When it was New Year's Eve and I was looking for ham hocks and collard greens, I knew I needed to travel to the Martins somewhere else, right? Seriously, this is the way this shows up in our everyday lives. The reason why we will look at our children and tell them, as one student told me when I asked them the racial messages they got from their parents, and they said to me, I just grew up knowing to never go to the low numbers. The streets at the lower end of the numbers, first, second, third, fourth, fifth. These were the messages she got from her parents that were ostensibly not about race at all, that were about safety, right? That were about, again, social geography, but that, of course, were absolutely about race, because what was in those neighborhoods and what assumptions did we have about those people? So it shapes that, and then it shapes how we gerrymander voting districts, quite frankly, and how we are able to not participate in processing the electoral process. Why the formerly incarcerated can't vote isn't just about the fact that they're formerly incarcerated, but that they're disproportionately more likely to be African American and therefore assumed to be Democratic voters, right? So it shapes, again, everything about our social system. That's my social 101.
Very good. Very good.
I just want to layer on too that I also think that there is a sense of people of color being the other and white being the norm. So there's a reason that the Virginia Fine Arts Museum is not called the White Virginia Museum Fine Arts Museum, and the Black History Museum is called the Black History Museum and not simply History Museum, right? So I also want to just name that there is, when I am identified in the press, no one says, local white leader Ted Lewis. No one says, white mayoral candidate Jack Berry. So there also is a default of who is considered a person. And in my view, I would say that the other way that social construct of race is to dehumanize people based on physical features we can see, to then enslave them, whether that is through chattel slavery, or whether that is through incarceration, or whether that is through trapping people in low-income schools. Right? Now, there's much more complicated than that, because I see Dr. Hader give me a look of like, you just messed up everything on this panel, and I'm going to get a talking to later, I'm sure. But I do think that there is a piece of the social construct. You know, we talk about the social construct, and in my opinion, if you look at, when I look at history, and I'll talk about this about LGBTQ stuff, the idea of someone being homosexual was created in language before the idea of someone being heterosexual, because it's easier to name the other and to other people. So in other words, the idea of blackness was developed before the idea of whiteness, because we had to define who these other was. And some of you are like, well, that's kind of true. Just go with me on this. But this idea of othering people, this idea of othering folks, And there's a dehumanizing factor in the social construct. It is not simply a make-believe, right, based on, oh, well, we look different, so we're gonna, do these structures. There is power dynamics involved in the way the U.S. structures race, and that has a global influence because of colonization and because of war and because of, right? It is fascinating to think that Russia may have influence in the U.S. election, and then when I talk to Latino, Latina, Latinx people in town, they're like, oh, you didn't realize a foreign government could intercede in your election? That's funny. Let me introduce you to the 1980s, right? Like, so there is a history too. If you think about the reality that in the US right now, there are 4 racial categories and 1 ethnicity, that Latino is considered an ethnicity but not a race, right? So part of the social contract also changes over time. The idea that Muslim somehow for some people has become a racial identity and not a religion, right? So I just want to also meant that the part of what's fascinating to me about social construction is that we continue to construct it. And right now, immigrant, and I love what somebody in the beginning said, immigrant means Latino. Even though if we look at actually black immigrants who are undocumented are disproportionately deported in the United States. Disproportionately impacted by immigration policy, disproportionately impacted by barriers to come into the United States overall. Yet, if you were to look at most media, so it's just about Latino folks. Right, so the construction continues is my main point here. And we can talk over the fine points.
And I think as a historian, that's one of the hardest things to explain, is that the construction of race, say, in 1850 is not the same one we live with. It's interesting how insidiously that those things can be changed. And there's always the baseline of superiority of white people, but how that's expressed is very different. Slavery is fundamentally just based on violence, raw violence to some large extent. That has changed after the Civil War. And then we invent segregation, and we did completely invent segregation. It was not some great old, as C. Van Woodward famously said, some legacy thing that Southerners, it was the way we do it down here. No, you invented that about 1900. So it's slippery. It's very hard as a historian to explain how we're here when we've gone through all these other phases of how race has been expressed.
All right, well, let's open.
What he said,
okay,
that
just
segregation
briefly.
is a 20th century phenomenon. And a lot of people don't realize that. But it really began in 1911 when Richmond segregated the city by race.
Okay. Let us open it up to the audience. If you have one question, I think we have time for one. Is that right, Samantha? We can take a few. All right. Keep them brief. From the audience, questions?
We do have, I'm sorry, before we take our audience questions, we do have some from Twitter. Oh. All right, we're getting technological. Okay. One question, how do we get our counties to own the effects of massive resistance in Richmond and to allow GRTC in their areas fully? Mark was distracted. The question was, how do we get our counties to own the effects of massive resistance in Richmond and allow GRTC in their areas fully? And if there are other panelists that want to speak to this, I'll pass you the mic.
That is not an easy question to answer.
And it came on Twitter.
Yeah, but it's good. Good job, Twitter. I'm not sure what owning massive resistance means, but let's set that aside. I think there is a logical path you can think about that promotes transportation, then housing integration, and then school integration. Insofar as we actually, and I think this is the regional possibility in the next 10 to 15 years, move to a regional transportation system. Because until that happens, you actually cannot deconcentrate poverty or reduce it. And obviously reducing it is more important. Hold on, Ben. Okay. When you actually have the possibility of building mixed income neighborhoods in the counties, which low income people can live side by side with higher income people, that in turn will create the possibility of more integrated schools And eventually, the hope is you get to the point where Enrico County and Richmond, city of Richmond, are actually pretty similar demographically, and then someone will say, why are we wasting all this money with duplicative services when we could be actually integrating? That's a 20 to 30 year play at best. Chesterfield will take longer. Sorry, but I really do think it starts with transportation.
The strange and interesting fact is that economically, right now, a full public transportation network would really be of a tremendous advantage to the counties as well as the city. And really, I mean, if you're actually just looking at money, the thing really works. And that's the measure of how stuck we are in our division. That even though we would make money, we're not doing it. In the last election, 77 cities in America had public referenda on new taxes to support a public transportation system, and 2/3 of them passed. And in 1960, Charlotte and Richmond were the same size. That's it.
Any questions?
Live? Yes, it is. Does any of the panelists know of any efforts or programs, initiatives that are going on around the country that are being successful in halting gentrification, providing neighborhood stabilization? You talked about mixed income neighborhoods. You talked desegregation in schools. And yet, if we end up like San Francisco and places where the service workers can't afford to live, if we allow gentrification to wipe out what makes Richmond Richmond, does anybody know what's happening nationally successfully that we might look at locally?
Actually, something is happening in Richmond right now that addresses that very good question. For the first time in Richmond's history, a community land trust has been developed. The purpose of this land trust is to provide affordable housing in gentrifying neighborhoods, and specifically it's going to focus to a large extent, not exclusively, on North Churchill. I don't have time to go into exactly how it works, what a community land trust is, but the whole intent of the development of this new way to make housing affordable is because of the very question that you raised.
Any more questions?
So we've heard a lot tonight about how all of these things impact the youth and impact college-age students, high school students. What advice or what would you say about empowering the youth? We've talked a lot about how adults can make these changes, but how do you empower the youth themselves to begin these processes? I know some of you are perceptive.
Hi, you're so cute. Hi. I don't think I was ever young. Okay, so I really don't. I don't remember being that young and beautiful. That's a great question. While I have my midlife crisis up there in front of 100 people. Thank you. The first thing is, I think you actually have the causation wrong. I don't think, there's always advice. I'm a professor. I have tons of advice for young people. That's literally my job. But let me tell you something that excites me. The most sustained, successful social movements of the last 7 to 10 years have been youth-led.
That's right.
I don't think we need to tell y'all much of anything.
Yeah.
I think what would do us, really, seriously, when I sit down and I'm watching, I'm terrified for you all the time, but I am so proud of what young people are doing right now. I seriously, literally believe that the fight for 15, Black Lives Matter, and so many of the other youth movements across, youth-led and youth-driven movements across the country are going to be the salvation of us all.
and we're going to owe them a lot. I think we're actually going to look up in 20 and 30 years, and our institutions are going to owe y'all a significant debt for bringing us out of that. But yeah, so doing what you're doing, which is to organize, I will say it's important to understand your social movements and the history and sort of the lineage of the history of those that have come before you, and we try to work with, I know I work with students at VCU about that all the time, but it's important as it is to know that history and to learn the lessons from it. You don't owe replicating parts of it that may not work. We call this a political economy, but times change. Political systems change, rules change. Nothing has changed how some of these things are happening right now more than how the labor market works and how technology works. And y'all just have, while similar issues, some qualitatively different issues to address than the ones that were being done in the 1960s and 1970s. And I think y'all are doing a good job of understanding the stakes of that game. I think learning better how to build processes across different places and different times. I think we all struggle with that. But I see young people maybe in our current movement struggling with that a little bit. How to build things that can be replicated and sustained. And you can maybe learn a little something about that. But again, I don't know that necessarily all of the advice needs to be going in one direction.
I'm sorry, I had to step in on this because I was going to say something about human agency, right? The ability to affect outcome. But I'm a little bit more, as an educator, a little bit more critical of this generation in large part because I don't think they recognize how much agency they have to affect outcome. And to your point about, you think about, for instance, what children of our generation, PDP dropped Criminal Mind when they were 17 years old, right? Nirvana, right, 1990, kids, right? And one of the things I'm most disturbed about as an educator is how much our kids the curiosity, right? I would just say recognize that context matters and it continues to shape your life. And if you recognize that context, then you can shape somebody else's, right? You've got the power.
And I just want to go with all the examples that Tressie and them said. I'd go even on local. What is it called now? Is it Coahuilco Middle School?
Yeah.
It used to be Byrd Middle School, right?
Jordan Chapman.
And that started from a student at Byrd. It was a young person that started that entire
Jordan
movement.
Chapman.
So what's her name?
Jordan
say
Chapman.
her name.
Jordan Chapman. We will say her name. Jordan Chapman.
But I do think that kind of understanding the context of what you said of those movements are very important. But don't wait. Because no one's, if you're waiting on someone for you to make change, it's never going to happen. Especially with people like.
You know what? And call on the ancestors. And I don't mean just because Barbara Johns is black that she can't be your ancestor or yours or anybody else's. But Barbara Johns was 16. When she led her movement. So call on them when you feel like you're in despair or you need hope. Call on the ancestors. Barbara Johns, 16, when she did what she did. You mentioned Jordan Chapman, a high school student who got. Why did we even have a school named after Harry Berry anyway? But anyway, the point is, she led that change. So, like Tressie was saying, learn from it, appreciate the history, learn from it, be inspired by it, call on the ancestors to help you move forward. But you don't need us. You don't need us.
You took the words right out of my mouth. Barbara Johns, what an inspiration. There was a book written by David Halberstam about the civil rights movement. And the title of the book was The Children.
I also just want to throw out that I think that the younger, when I work with youth is, again, a much more intersectional approach to justice. It is not, we're going to talk about black on Monday, we're going to talk about women on Tuesday, we're going to talk about gay people on Wednesday. It is the recognition that lesbian black women exist and have been on the forefront of the movement for decades, generations, millenniums, right? So it is also an acknowledgement that the coalitions that we see forming are also not new necessarily, but what I think is that with what I love about the young people, so let me give you an example. There's a high school that the name of the high school is escaping me, I apologize, but it is out in, it's not in Richmond, but it's in Central Virginia, and they had a Gay-Straight Alliance, and they decided to change the name of the Gay-Straight Alliance to, you know the story I'm talking about, right? So they decided to ally with the Muslim student group that they had before, and they decided to become a safety network, because those were the two most targeted groups in their school. And so they realized, they said, you know what, we could continue to try to fight this one-on-one, or we could recognize that if we got our stuff together and stood up for each other, even though we're not the same, we could actually really do some change, right? And so what I think is, my advice, But to be honest with you, this is what I've learned from youth that I work with every day. It is the constant questioning, and it is the constant asking of where do people like me and my identity show up in your work, right? So it is the going to the VMFA and saying, where are all the black people that are supposed to be on the walls? Where are Latino, Latina, Latinx people in your library? Why is there not LGBTQ people talked about in history, right? So it's those moments of continually questioning the adults around you, and not saying, can we please have, it's where is it? This should be here. This is not, if people who look like you and people who share your identity are not talked about, then the school is doing you a disservice, right? And so, and again, I see this happen all the time, right? If I can, again, see youth who are 11, 12 years old starting gay-straight alliances in middle schools in Chester, Virginia, okay? Then you can, if you asked people my age, if we ever thought same-sex marriage was gonna happen, we would all have told you no, right? So the reality is that those changes happen because of young people, and question adults and recognize that as much time as, for example, I need to spend on my oppressed identities and thinking about how do I make change for me that's going to be good, I have to spend just as much, if not more time, figuring out the moments where I need to use my privilege. Free's question before about what are you doing with your white privilege is a real question that every single white person needs to ask themselves and answer, not every month, but every day. So if I really want to believe in ending racism, what am I doing to liberate people and communities of color right here in Richmond? And that needs to be a question I ask every single day if I'm really real about it. Okay?
Well, unfortunately, we have to end our conversation right now, but this is not the end. We'll continue this conversation on February 9th, but I want you to give all of our panelists a round of applause for a job well done. Very nice. And thank you all so much for your questions. Thank you for coming out. We'll see you right back here February 9th.
I can't be blaming whitey for the slave trade.